I never knew silence could roar. Not until that moment, standing beneath the cold fluorescence of Gate 17, wrapped in a wedding dress that felt more like a shroud than a symbol of joy, while the world kept moving as if my life hadn't just split clean down the middle. There was laughter from a nearby family, a rolling suitcase bumping along the tiles, a flight attendant's voice drifting through the speakers like an echo from another universe. Final boarding call for Flight 392 to Bali. And then, like a cruel joke, my phone buzzed. It was his name. Ethan. For a heartbeat, I felt everything. The trembling hope that maybe he'd changed his mind, that maybe this was the part of the story where he came running back through the terminal with that crooked smile and 1,000 apologies. I opened the message, and just like that, the universe stopped holding its breath. I can't do this. 4 words, 4 knives. My knees almost gave out, and I don't even know how I managed to walk. Maybe it was pride, or shock, or the sheer disbelief that this could be happening to me. My reflection in the airport window looked like a stranger. Mascara streaked down my cheeks, the lace of my gown wrinkled from hours of sitting and waiting, the veil limp and heavy like it was mourning me. I looked like a ghost of the woman I was supposed to be. The crowd moved around me, a blur of motion, and I just stood there, frozen in a moment that refused to end. I'd spent months planning the perfect wedding, the perfect life, the perfect escape from the small town that had smothered me for years. I thought love was supposed to be a beginning, but it turns out it can also be the cleanest kind of ending. When the announcement came that my flight was departing, I didn't even move. Why would I? My groom wasn't on that plane, and I wasn't anyone's bride anymore. I was just a girl in a white dress with nowhere to go. Somewhere deep inside me, a laugh tried to crawl out, the kind that comes from madness, not humor. I bit it back and walked to the nearest bench, ignoring the looks, the whispers, the way people tried not to stare but always did. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to find him and make him explain how a man could vanish so easily after promising forever. But I didn't even know where to start. His phone was off, his apartment empty. His friends hadn't seen him. As if he'd evaporated into the air, leaving me clutching the ashes of a dream I'd built around his name. Hours passed, maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. My phone battery blinked red and then died, leaving me in a strange kind of peace. No more messages, no more hope. The world around me blurred until all I saw were outlines and movement. A child crying. A couple kissing. A janitor pushing a mop across the floor, with the slow rhythm of someone who's seen it all before. And then came the voice. You look like you've been left behind by the world. It was smooth, deep, with an accent I couldn't place. Italian, maybe. I turned, expecting to see a stranger passing by, but instead there he was. Tall, immaculately dressed, a man whose presence didn't belong in an airport full of ordinary people. His suit was black, tailored within an inch of perfection. His dark hair slicked back just enough to show the sharp edges of his face, the kind of face that could belong on a magazine cover, or a wanted poster. His eyes, God, his eyes were like winter, beautiful, distant, and utterly merciless. I started, but my voice cracked like a brittle bone. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, the corner of his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. You waiting for someone? The question was harmless, but something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I wanted to say no, but the words stuck in my throat. Maybe because admitting it out loud would make it real, that I had been left. I whispered finally. He nodded once, as if he understood something deeper than what I said. And now? I looked down at my crumpled dress. Now I don't know. For a moment he said nothing, and the silence stretched between us, strange and heavy, like static before a storm. Then he slipped his hands into his pockets and said, almost casually. Airports are full of ghosts. People coming, people going, never realizing how easily they can disappear. The way he said it made my skin prickle. I should have walked away right then. I should have gathered what was left of my pride and left that terminal, found a cheap hotel, cried myself into a new version of survival. But something in his voice kept me there. A dangerous calm, a magnetic pull that whispered, "Listen." He glanced at my empty luggage trolley. "You're not flying anywhere." I shook my head. Not anymore. He studied me again, too closely. "Pity. You look like someone who should always be in motion." I laughed softly, a broken sound. Not much motion in getting abandoned. Something flickered across his face. Not pity exactly, but curiosity, like he was studying a puzzle no one else could solve. "Maybe being left behind is just another way of being found," he said, his tone unreadable. "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly, as if he'd already decided something in his mind. "Where were you headed?" "Bali." My voice was barely a whisper. "Paradise." He said the word like it was something filthy. "Come." I blinked. "Excuse me?" He gestured toward the private terminal visible through the glass. "You shouldn't be alone tonight. I have a jet leaving in an hour. Let me take you somewhere better." I should have said no. I should have laughed in his face, called security, or at least questioned why a stranger in a black suit was inviting a broken girl in a wedding dress onto his private jet. But something inside me, the same part that had once believed in fairy tales, in redemption, in love that healed, whispered, "What else do you have to lose?" I hesitated, heart pounding, and he stepped closer. The scent of him hit me. Smoke, leather, something dark and expensive. "You look like someone who's been waiting for a new beginning," he murmured, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "I can give you one." I wanted to ask who he was, what he wanted, why his words felt both dangerous and intoxicating at once. But before I could speak, the loudspeaker blared overhead, calling another flight. He watched me flinch and smiled slightly, as if he already knew the answer I hadn't spoken. "Don't worry, Bella Mia," he said softly. "You won't be left behind again." And before I could understand what that promise meant, or the threat hidden beneath it, he turned and began walking toward the private gate, expecting me to follow. I stood there for a long moment, staring after him, torn between fear and the haunting sense that destiny had just changed direction. The airport around me buzzed with life, people chasing departures, clinging to arrivals, while I stood on the edge of something I couldn't name. And then, with trembling hands and a heart that didn't know whether it was breaking or beginning again, I took a step forward. Toward him. Toward the jet. Toward the kind of mistake that would change everything. The air outside the main terminal felt heavier, thicker somehow, as though the night itself was watching me make a decision it already knew I would regret. The city lights blurred through the misty glass of the airport windows, smearing like wet paint, and every footstep I took toward the private wing echoed louder than it should have, as if the ground was warning me. "Turn back, Isabella. Turn back while you still can." But I didn't. He walked ahead of me with that slow, deliberate grace that comes from someone who has never been told no in his life, every movement radiating quiet authority, as though the world existed only to part before his steps. I didn't even know his name yet. All I knew was that the curve of his shoulders beneath that perfectly tailored jacket, and the calm way he looked over his shoulder once, just to make sure I was still following, made me feel like I was slipping into a story that wasn't mine. One of those dark fairy tales where the monster is beautiful enough to make you forget he's dangerous. The private terminal was nothing like the chaos of the main concourse. It was quieter, colder, the air perfumed faintly with jet fuel and money. A single attendant waited behind a sleek marble counter, her expression polite but wary when her eyes flicked from him to me, to my crumpled wedding dress, to my smudged eyeliner, to the girl who didn't belong here. He murmured something in Italian that I couldn't catch, his voice smooth and low, and she immediately nodded, pressing a button that opened the frosted glass doors to the runway. The wind hit me like a slap, sharp, cold, smelling of rain and jet exhaust. And there it was, his plane. Sleek, black, a predatory shape against the silver night. I had seen private jets before on screens and magazine covers, but nothing prepared me for the quiet power of seeing one waiting for me, its engines humming with restrained menace. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, gripping the railing as if it could anchor me to the reality I was about to abandon. "Are you coming?" he asked, standing at the top of the stairs, his voice carried easily through the wind. I swallowed, my throat dry, my heart beating too loudly in my ears. "You still haven't told me where we're going?" He smiled, that slow, dangerous kind of smile that says you'll follow anyway. "Somewhere better than where you've been." It should have terrified me. It did. But it also thrilled me in a way that made me hate myself a little. I took a deep breath and climbed. Inside, the plane felt like another world entirely. All soft leather and dim lighting, the faintest scent of whiskey and cedarwood lingering in the air. Everything gleamed, the gold trim on the seats, the polished wood paneling, even the glass of champagne waiting on the counter, as if someone had known I would need it. My reflection in the cabin window looked strange and ghostly, a woman still dressed for a future that had never arrived. He gestured toward one of the seats. "Sit." I obeyed, more out of instinct than intention, my fingers fumbling with the layers of my dress. He loosened his tie, unbuttoned his jacket, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something inked on the side of his wrist. Dark lines, maybe letters, something sharp and deliberate that disappeared under his sleeve. "What's your name?" I asked finally, needing something to hold on to. He poured 2 glasses of champagne before answering. "Luca." The name rolled off his tongue like smoke. "And you?" he asked, handing me the glass. "Isabella," I said softly. "Isabella Moretti." "Isabella," he repeated, tasting the syllables like wine. Beautiful name, fitting. There was a way he said it, not like a compliment, but like a claim. I took a sip of the champagne to hide my nerves, though the bubbles burned down my throat. "What are you doing here, Luca?" I asked after a moment. "You don't seem like someone who just hangs around airports rescuing abandoned brides." He chuckled, a sound low and dangerous. "Maybe I enjoy helping people who've been left behind." "I don't believe that," I said, surprising even myself with how steady my voice sounded. He looked at me, really looked, and the air shifted. "Good," he said. "Don't believe everything you hear." For a while, silence filled the space between us. Not awkward, but charged, like electricity before a storm. Outside the window, the rain began to fall, thin streaks against the glass, and the hum of the engines deepened. I realized then that we were moving, taxiing down the runway, and panic flared briefly in my chest. "Wait," I said, sitting up. "I didn't agree to—" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes catching mine with unsettling precision. "You got on the plane, Isabella. You agreed the moment you took that step." "I don't even know where we're going." He smiled faintly. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." "Then let's say," he murmured, his gaze holding mine until I couldn't look away, "we're going somewhere far from pain. Isn't that what you want?" His words were like velvet wrapping around a blade. I wanted to tell him no, to demand answers, to get off this plane before it was too late. But something about his voice, calm, deliberate, almost hypnotic, made me hesitate. The truth was, I did want to escape. I wanted to disappear so badly it hurt, and he could see it written all over me. The plane lifted off the ground, and my stomach lurched as the city lights fell away, turning into distant constellations beneath us. The vibration of the engines thrummed through the floor, steady and alive. I watched the world shrink and vanish into clouds, wondering when exactly I'd lost control. Maybe the moment Ethan texted, or maybe years before, when I first learned how easy it was for love to lie. Luca stood and poured himself a darker drink. Whiskey, judging by the scent. He didn't offer me one this time. "You'll rest when we land," he said. I frowned. "Land where?" His lips curved. "Sicily." I blinked, caught off guard. Sicily, but why Sicily? He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving mine. "Because that's where I'm needed. And now apparently where you are too." I didn't know what that meant. But the way he said it sent a ripple of unease through me. Something about this wasn't chance. I wanted to ask how he'd found me, why he'd been there, what game he was playing. But my tongue felt heavy, the champagne dulling my thoughts, and the exhaustion I'd been holding back for hours finally began to settle in. "Why me?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear when he spoke. "Because some people cross our path by accident," he said softly, "and others because fate dragged them there kicking and screaming." My pulse jumped, and I turned toward him. But his expression gave nothing away. Those dark eyes unreadable, like deep water hiding something beneath the surface. As I leaned back into the seat, trying to process everything, I realized the truth in a wave of cold clarity. I wasn't just running from heartbreak anymore. I was stepping into something vast and dangerous, something I didn't understand. Luca looked out the window, his jaw tense, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines when he said, "Once we land, Isabella, you'll understand why you couldn't stay behind." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could speak, the lights in the cabin dimmed and the sound of the storm outside grew louder, as if the sky itself was warning me of what waited ahead. And as the first flash of lightning split the horizon, I realized this flight wasn't taking me toward freedom. It was carrying me straight into the eye of a storm I might never escape. The plane cut through the night like a blade through silk, and as I sat there watching clouds swallow the world below, I couldn't decide which terrified me more, the idea of falling or the realization that I already had. The cabin hummed softly, the sound of the engines blending with the low whisper of air rushing against the fuselage, a sound too steady to belong to something fragile. It was almost comforting in a strange, delirious way, as though this metal cage suspended above the world was safer than the earth I'd left behind. But safety was an illusion. And sitting across from Luca DeSantis, I was beginning to understand that illusions were his favorite game. He looked at home here. Not just comfortable, but powerful in that quiet, unspoken way that makes everyone else fade into the background. He'd discarded his jacket, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a gold chain glinting faintly against his throat. The dim light cast his features in half shadow, the strong cut of his jaw, the sharp line of his cheekbone, the eyes that seemed to shift from warmth to danger and back again in the space of a heartbeat. He wasn't watching me, not directly, but he didn't need to. Somehow, even when his gaze was turned toward the window, I could feel it tethered to me, as though he was always aware of where I was, what I was doing, what I was thinking. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was the exhaustion, the confusion, the champagne still buzzing faintly through my veins. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something about him that demanded attention, that consumed every inch of the room until there was nothing left for anyone else to occupy. And the strange thing was, I didn't hate it. I should have. But I didn't. I wanted to ask him about Sicily, about why he'd brought me here, about what exactly a man like him did that required a private jet and a crew who didn't make eye contact. But every time I opened my mouth, something in his silence warned me to stay quiet. The two men seated near the cockpit looked like soldiers disguised as attendants, their movements efficient, their faces carved from stone. One of them nodded occasionally when Luca spoke to him in low Italian, but otherwise no one said a word. The air was heavy with secrets, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt like I'd become one of them. After a long stretch of silence, Luca finally turned to me. "Are you afraid of flying?" His voice was casual, almost lazy, but there was something deliberate in the question, as if he was trying to measure me. "I don't know," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. "I've never been on a private jet before." "Then it's a night of firsts," he said, a faint smirk ghosting across his lips. "A flight without a destination, a stranger without fear." I didn't say I wasn't afraid. He looked amused, the kind of amusement that makes you feel like you've said exactly what he wanted you to. "Then what are you afraid of, Isabella?" The way he said my name, soft, deliberate, as though it belonged to him already, made it hard to breathe for a second. I looked out the window, watching lightning flash faintly in the distance, illuminating the clouds like bruises on the sky. "I'm afraid of not knowing where I'm going," I said finally. He leaned back in his seat, fingers brushing along the rim of his glass. "Most people don't know where they're going," he said. "They only pretend to." "That sounds like something a cynic would say." "Maybe," he murmured, "or someone who's learned the cost of pretending." There it was again, the quiet gravity in his words, the weight of a man who'd seen too much, done too much, and learned to live with the ghosts of it all. I wanted to ask him what those costs were, but something in his expression warned me that if I did, I wouldn't be ready for the answer. The turbulence hit without warning. The plane jolted violently, glasses rattling, the cabin lights flickering once before steadying again. My breath caught as I gripped the armrests, my heart slamming against my ribs like it wanted out. Luca didn't move, didn't even blink. He just looked at me, his lips curving slightly as if to say, "See, the sky has a temper too." "Relax," he said quietly. "It's just the wind reminding us we're not invincible." "Some of us don't need the reminder," I muttered, forcing a shaky laugh that sounded more like a plea. His gaze softened just a fraction. "You've had a long day." "That's one way to put it." He stood then, unhurried, and crossed the narrow space between us. His presence filled the air like smoke, heavy, inescapable. He crouched beside me, his hand brushing the back of mine briefly, a touch so fleeting and yet so electric it sent a shiver straight through me. "You're safe," he said, his voice low, rougher now. "I wouldn't have brought you here if you weren't." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But something inside me whispered that safety wasn't what he was offering. "Why me, Luca?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you stop? You could have just walked past me." His eyes held mine for a long time. Too long, before he answered, "Because you looked like someone who'd already been left behind. And I don't like unfinished stories." It was such a strange thing to say, poetic and threatening all at once. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the engines roared louder as the plane climbed higher through another layer of storm clouds. My stomach twisted, and I closed my eyes, breathing through the panic until his voice cut through again. Softer this time, almost tender. "Open your eyes," he said. When I did, I found him still there, closer than before, his face only inches from mine. The stormlight flickered through the window, painting him in flashes of silver and shadow. For a heartbeat, the fear and the pull of him collided, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He smiled faintly, almost like he could read the chaos in my head. "There you go," he murmured. That's better. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Not touching, not speaking, just existing in that suspended space between danger and desire. The world outside disappeared into black, and I wondered if maybe that was the point. That up here, you could forget who you were, what you'd lost, the life waiting for you to fall apart. When the turbulence eased and the plane steadied, he finally rose, straightened his cuffs, and said, "We land soon." I blinked, disoriented. Already? He nodded once. Time moves differently when you stop counting it. I didn't know what that meant, but before I could ask, the intercom crackled, and one of his men said something in Italian. Quick, clipped, efficient. Luca's expression shifted, the softness vanishing in an instant, replaced by something colder, sharper, like a blade sliding back into a familiar hand. "Change of plans," he said. "What kind of plans?" He didn't answer. He just moved toward the front of the cabin, exchanging a few quiet words with the crew, his body language calm but controlled. I caught fragments. Atterrare subito. Sicurezza. Nessun rischio. And even with my limited understanding, I knew enough to feel the unease spread through me. Something wasn't right. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. "We're landing somewhere else," he said simply. "Where?" He hesitated, then smiled in that disarming way that felt like a lie wrapped in silk. "Somewhere safer." And even though I wanted to demand the truth, to scream at him for dragging me into whatever this was, I couldn't move. Because the way he said it, safer, didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a warning. Outside, the storm cleared just enough for me to see the faint outline of land below. Dark, sprawling, surrounded by the restless shimmer of waves. And as the plane began its descent, my hands tightened around the seat, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and something far more dangerous. I wasn't going home. I wasn't sure I ever would again. The descent began with a strange silence, not the comforting kind that invites peace, but the hollow stillness that comes before something inevitable, the kind that makes your heartbeat sound too loud in your own ears, as if your body is trying to remind you that you're still alive while everything else conspires to make you forget it. The hum of the engines softened. The cabin lights dimmed to a ghostly amber, and outside the window, the world below revealed itself in fractured glimpses through the thinning clouds. A stretch of coastline bathed in moonlight, a sliver of ocean turning silver under the plane's wing, and beyond it, the jagged shadow of mountains that looked less like land and more like sleeping beasts. I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching the dark outline of the island grow clearer, its shape slowly sharpening until I could make out lights along the shoreline. Distant, scattered, too few to belong to a city. "Where are we?" I asked quietly, though the words felt too small in the vastness of the cabin. Luca stood near the aisle, phone in hand, speaking in low, measured Italian that rolled off his tongue like velvet dipped in smoke. I couldn't understand most of it, but I caught fragments. Sicuro, autorizzazione, preparare la macchina, words that didn't sound like the vocabulary of an ordinary man. When he ended the call, he looked at me, and though his expression was calm, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but alertness, like a predator who's scented something in the air. "Sicily," he said, finally answering my question, his voice smooth but distant. "We're landing on private ground?" "Private ground." The phrase alone made my pulse stutter. "You own this?" He smiled faintly, that enigmatic curve of his lips that never quite reached his eyes. "My family does." Something about the way he said family sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't pride, it was possession, the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to a legacy that had been built on things unspoken and unclean. The wheels touched the runway with a shuddering thud, the sound echoing like thunder through the small cabin. And as the plane slowed, I caught sight of the landing strip, a stretch of asphalt carved out between cliffs and sea, surrounded by shadowed figures standing just far enough from the lights to remain faceless. My stomach twisted, instinct whispering the same word over and over again. Run. But there was nowhere to go. The plane stopped, the engines powered down, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Luca straightened his cuffs, his every movement deliberate, as if he was putting his armor back on piece by piece. When he finally looked at me, his gaze softened just slightly, though not enough to feel safe. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, and I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a promise. The door opened with a hiss, letting in a rush of night air thick with salt and something earthy. Olives, rain, the faint trace of smoke. The first thing I noticed was how dark it was, the kind of darkness that felt old, as if it belonged to another time entirely. The second thing was the men waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, broad, dressed in black coats despite the mild air, their faces expressionless, their stances uniform. Not bodyguards, soldiers. Luca descended first, his presence commanding even in silence, and the moment his polished shoes touched the ground, every one of those men straightened with military precision. I hesitated at the top of the steps, my hand gripping the railing until my knuckles turned white, and for a second, the absurdity of it all crashed over me. Hours ago, I'd been crying in an airport, a girl in a ruined wedding dress abandoned by love, and now I was standing on a private runway in Sicily, surrounded by men who looked like they could make people disappear. One of them, older, graying at the temples, with eyes that seemed too sharp for comfort, spoke rapidly in Italian, his tone respectful but urgent. Luca responded with a calm nod, a few clipped words, and then turned to glance back at me. "Come," he said simply. I followed, the hem of my dress dragging against the tarmac, my heels clicking unevenly. The older man gave me a look, not unkind but assessing, as though trying to decide what kind of problem I might become. He murmured something to Luca, who replied without hesitation. Whatever he said made the man smile faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, before he stepped aside. A black car waited nearby, its sleek body gleaming under the runway lights. Luca opened the door himself and gestured for me to get in. I hesitated, glancing around, the guards, the plane, the endless darkness stretching in every direction. "You expect me to just go with you?" I asked, my voice trembling more from disbelief than fear. He leaned closer, and the faintest ghost of a smirk touched his mouth. "You already did, Bella Mia." I slid into the car, the leather cool against my skin, and he followed, closing the door behind us. The driver, another silent man in black, pulled away from the airstrip, and the plane disappeared behind us, swallowed by distance and shadow. The road wound upward through the hills, the headlights cutting narrow paths through olive groves and cypress trees, and every turn seemed to pull us further from the world I knew. After several minutes of silence, I finally spoke. "You still haven't told me why I'm here." He rested one arm along the window ledge, his gaze fixed ahead. "You were at the airport because you were abandoned," he said slowly. "And I was there because I was waiting for someone who never came." The words hit harder than I expected. "So what? You just picked me instead?" He chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "You could say fate made the introduction. I don't believe in fate. You will?" Something about the quiet certainty in his tone sent another shiver down my spine. I turned to the window, watching as the landscape shifted. Stone walls, flickering lanterns, the faint outline of a massive villa rising on the hillside like something carved from a dream. Its windows glowed faintly against the night. golden eyes watching us approach. When the car stopped at the entrance, 2 more men opened the gates, their movements as synchronized as a ritual. Luca stepped out first, offering me his hand, and though part of me wanted to refuse out of sheer defiance, I took it. His grip was warm, firm, grounding in a way that felt almost cruel. The villa was enormous, not the sterile kind of wealth you see in magazines, but old, lived in, powerful. The kind of place that had seen generations rise and fall within its walls. Marble floors, high ceilings, flickering candles instead of lamps. Every detail whispered history, luxury, and danger. "This is your home?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked around the grand hall as if seeing it for the first time. "It was my father's once. Now it's mine." I wanted to ask what happened to his father, but something in the way he said it stopped me. His tone wasn't proud. It was weighted, almost weary. A woman appeared then, older, elegant, her hair pulled into a sleek bun. She gave me a look that managed to blend curiosity and caution, then turned to Luca. "Elle?" she asked softly. Luca nodded. "Si." Whatever that meant, the woman didn't argue. She simply inclined her head and disappeared down a corridor, leaving me with more questions than I could voice. Luca motioned for me to follow him up the grand staircase, our footsteps echoing in the vast space. "You'll rest here tonight," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." "Talk about what?" He paused at the top of the stairs, turning just enough for his eyes to meet mine. "About why fate decided to cross our paths, and what it intends to take in return." The words lingered in the air, long after he walked away, echoing through the silence of that cavernous house. And as I stood there, surrounded by shadows and secrets, I realized something chilling. I hadn't been rescued. I'd been chosen. Morning came reluctantly, bleeding slowly through the gauzy curtains of the guest room, like light trying to find permission to enter. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the stillness. No cars, no city noise, no distant hum of life. Only the sound of the sea brushing against the cliffs below the villa. A low, rhythmic whisper that seemed to belong to another century. I sat up, disoriented for a moment, staring at the ornate canopy above me. The gilded molding, the carved wooden doors, the bouquet of white lilies that someone had left by the bedside table. Everything smelled faintly of salt and candle wax, and something else, something older, deeper, like dust soaked in memory. For a few minutes I just sat there, trying to remember how I'd arrived here. The memories of the night before came back slowly. The private jet, the soldiers, the black car twisting through the hills, Luca's voice low and steady as he told me to rest. I hadn't wanted to sleep, hadn't trusted myself to close my eyes in a house I didn't understand. But exhaustion had won. And now, daylight didn't make the place any less unreal. I slipped out of bed and walked toward the balcony, the stone floor cool beneath my bare feet. The view was staggering, the coastline unfurling below like a painted dream, the Mediterranean shimmering in the distance, sunlight breaking over the cliffs like molten gold. For a fleeting moment I could almost believe this was paradise, if not for the faint trace of unease that curled in my stomach like smoke. Beauty, I was learning, could be as dangerous as any weapon. There was a soft knock at the door. I turned, startled, as the older woman from the night before entered carrying a folded dress. "Buongiorno, signorina," she said, with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. DeSantis requests your presence for dinner tonight. He asks that you wear this." Dinner. The word lingered strangely. Intimate, deliberate. "Dinner?" I repeated. "With him?" She nodded once, setting the dress on the bed. "At 8 o'clock. Please be ready." I wanted to ask where I was supposed to go until I remembered. There were guards everywhere. If Luca wanted me at that table, I'd be brought there. I ran my fingers over the fabric. It was a deep shade of wine-red silk. Simple but elegant. The kind of dress that revealed more than it concealed without crossing into vulgarity. It wasn't something I would have chosen for myself, but somehow it looked as though it had been chosen for me. The size perfect, the style deliberate. As the hours passed, I tried to make sense of my surroundings, wandering the corridors of the villa when no one stopped me. The place was vast. Hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men and beautiful women with secrets in their eyes. Rooms filled with the kind of old-world wealth that doesn't have to announce itself because it's built into the walls. The few people I encountered moved with quiet efficiency. Servants who lowered their gazes, guards who pretended not to see me. I might as well have been invisible. By the time evening came, my nerves were taut as violin strings. I slipped into the dress, brushed out my hair, and took one last look at myself in the mirror. The girl staring back didn't look like the woman who'd been abandoned at an airport 2 days ago. She looked like someone else entirely. Someone who had stumbled into a story she didn't understand, wearing the colors of danger. A knock sounded again, and when I opened the door, one of the guards stood there, tall, silent, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, just nodded for me to follow. The corridors were dimly lit now, the glow from wall sconces casting long shadows that seemed to move as we passed. When we reached the grand dining room, I stopped at the threshold, unable to help the small gasp that escaped my lips. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, polished wood gleaming under the crystal chandelier. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting their trembling light over plates of porcelain and glasses that looked like they could shatter under a whisper. There were others already seated, men in dark suits, a few women draped in expensive silence, all of them turning their heads as I entered. The atmosphere was thick, not with noise but with presence. And at the head of the table sat Luca. He rose when he saw me, and for a moment everything else blurred. The laughter, the murmurs, the sound of the sea outside. All of it disappeared beneath the weight of his gaze. He was dressed in black again, though this time without a tie, his shirt open at the collar, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw softening the sharpness of his features. He looked at me like a secret he'd already learned how to keep. "Isabella," he said, his voice smooth and warm in a way that made me uneasy. "You look." He paused, eyes tracing the dress, the way I stood. Unexpected. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. His touch was steady, confident, the kind of touch that tells you everything you need to know about power, that it doesn't need to be loud to be felt. He guided me to the seat beside him, ignoring the curious glances from the others, as though daring them to question it. As soon as I sat down, the conversations resumed, though softer now, the way people speak when they know they're being listened to. The first course arrived, delicate slices of antipasto, the smell of olives and basil heavy in the air. I barely touched my plate. My appetite had been replaced by a gnawing sense of unease, every instinct whispering that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. At one point, one of the men across the table, broad-shouldered, his eyes sharp with arrogance, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Our Don has strange company tonight," he said in accented English, his tone mocking. Usually his guests come with last names that matter. The laughter that followed was brief and brittle. Luca didn't smile. He didn't even turn his head. He simply set down his glass with a quiet precision that cut through the noise like a blade. "Be careful, Marco," he said softly, the words spoken like silk stretched over steel. "Last names can be changed, mouths cannot." The silence that followed was absolute. Marco paled, muttered something in apology, and looked down at his plate. Luca's hand brushed mine under the table, not tenderly, but possessively, as though to say, "See, I protect what's mine." The contact burned. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of half-heard conversations and glances that carried more meaning than words. When the final course was cleared away and the wine glasses emptied, the others began to leave one by one, offering Luca quiet nods or murmured farewells in Italian. When the last of them had gone, the vast dining room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the chandeliers. I turned to him, unsure whether to thank him or demand answers. "What was that?" I asked. "That display? What did I just sit through?" He regarded me for a long moment before answering. "Business," he said simply. "Family." "That wasn't a family," I said. "That was an army." He smiled faintly, though there was nothing warm in it. In my world, there isn't much difference. I stared at him, my heart pounding, realization dawning like a shadow creeping through light. "You're not just rich, are you?" I whispered. "You're—" "Careful," he interrupted softly, his gaze locking on mine. Some truths sound heavier when spoken out loud. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. I wanted to leave, to run, to tear off this silk disguise and find a way back to the life that had abandoned me. But instead I stayed seated, trapped by curiosity and fear, and something darker that I didn't want to name. Luca stood, circling behind my chair, his fingers brushing the backrest as he passed. "You should rest," he said quietly, leaning close enough that his breath grazed my ear. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what happens next." I turned to look at him, but he was already walking away, his shadow long and deliberate across the marble floor. And as I sat there alone at that impossibly long table, the candles flickering lower, the scent of smoke and salt thick in the air, I understood something with startling clarity. I hadn't just stumbled into Luca's world. I had been invited into it. And whatever he had planned for me, dinner was only the beginning. The villa was quieter after that dinner, quieter in a way that didn't feel like peace but like a breath being held, suspended somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, waiting to see whether the world would exhale or shatter. I spent the night wandering the hallways, unable to sleep, haunted by the soft echo of Luca's voice and the way the others had looked at me. Curiosity cloaked in judgment, intrigue masking unease. It wasn't just that I didn't belong here. It was that I didn't understand the rules of the world I'd stepped into. A world where power was currency, silence was armor, and names carried the weight of kingdoms. When dawn came, I was still awake, sitting by the balcony doors and watching the horizon bleed from indigo to gold. The sea below shimmered in the early light, deceptively calm, and I thought about how easy it would be to disappear into it, to let the waves erase everything. The wedding dress, the heartbreak, the man with the dark eyes who had appeared at an airport and rewritten my story without asking. But something deeper kept me rooted. Not fear exactly, but a kind of compulsion, an ache to understand him, to understand why. I didn't see Luca until evening. The hours in between were a blur of uneasy waiting, of trying to make sense of a place that didn't make sense. The housekeeper, whose name I learned was Teresa, brought me food I couldn't eat and spoke in clipped Italian that made me feel like a guest in a language as well as a home. Once, I caught her watching me with something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't indifference either. The kind of look that said, "I know what happens to people who get too close to men like him." When he finally summoned me, it wasn't with words, but with presence. A soft knock on the door, followed by one of his men informing me, politely but firmly, that Mr. DeSantis requests your company. The phrasing made it sound like an invitation, but we both knew it wasn't. He was in the library when I entered, seated in a leather armchair near the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The room smelled of old books and smoke, the kind of space where secrets felt at home. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked too worn to have been read for pleasure. The evening light fell in slanted gold across his face, catching the faintest trace of exhaustion beneath his composure. "Sit," he said quietly, and it wasn't a request. I sat across from him, my fingers twisted together in my lap, the silence between us stretching until it was almost unbearable. Finally, I said, "You said we'd talk about what happens next." He took a slow sip of his drink, watching me over the rim of the glass. "Do you always walk into the lion's den demanding answers?" "I think I deserve some," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my tone. "You brought me here without telling me why. You said fate crossed our paths, but fate doesn't come with armed guards and private jets. So tell me, Luca, who are you really, and what do you want from me?" For a long time he said nothing. Then he set his glass down, stood and crossed to the window. The light haloed him in a way that made him look almost otherworldly, a figure carved from both darkness and grace. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "You think I'm a monster? I think you want me to." He turned then, and for the first time I saw something raw flicker across his expression. Not anger, not pride, but something far more human. "My family built an empire, Isabella. Not the kind that's written about in history books, but the kind that exists in the shadows between power and corruption, where loyalty means blood and betrayal is a death sentence. The DeSantis name carries weight, in politics, in business, and yes, in things that don't appear on paper." My pulse quickened, the truth unfurling like smoke. "You mean the Mafia?" He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "If you like old words, yes. My father ruled this world with iron and fear. I was raised in it, molded by it. You don't get to choose the soil you grow from, only what you do with the roots." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "And what does that have to do with me?" His gaze sharpened, cutting straight through me. "Your fiancé, Ethan Carter." The sound of his name was like a blow. "What about him?" Luca stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man approaching a confession he'd rehearsed too many times. "He wasn't just some ordinary man running from a wedding. He worked for one of my rivals, the Giordano family. He was their courier, their messenger. I knew his face long before I saw you." The room seemed to tilt, the air thickening until I could barely breathe. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Ethan's an accountant. He hated danger. He hated even the idea of—" "People are good at pretending," Luca said softly, "especially when they have something to hide, or someone to use." I shook my head, the denial spilling out instinctively. "No, you're lying. He wouldn't—" "I'm not," he interrupted, and the calm in his voice was worse than anger. "He took money that wasn't his. He betrayed men who don't forgive betrayal. And when he realized what it would cost him, he ran. But not before using you as his shield." I stared at him, the words sinking in like cold rain, one by one, until I couldn't tell if the shiver running through me was fear or disbelief. "You're saying he left me there to— what? Protect himself?" Luca's eyes darkened. "He left you because he knew we were watching. He thought abandoning you would erase his scent, that we'd think you were collateral, innocent, irrelevant. But fate," he said, his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, "has a cruel sense of humor. I found you instead." I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to hold the pieces of myself together, but they were slipping, cracking, breaking under the weight of it all. My heart thudded painfully, and for a moment I hated him. Hated his calm, his certainty, his ability to strip my world bare with a few words. "So what am I now, Luca?" I asked bitterly. "Your leverage? Your pawn in some war I don't even understand?" He didn't flinch. At first, he said quietly, that's exactly what you were. The honesty hit harder than any lie. I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, anger flaring through the grief like lightning through a storm. At first? I demanded. So what changed? He moved toward me then, slowly, deliberately, until he was close, enough that I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of smoke and cedar and danger that clung to his skin. His eyes searched mine, and what I saw there made the room spin. Not pity, not manipulation, but something I couldn't name. You did, he said simply. You changed it. I wanted to speak, but the words refused to come. He reached out then, fingers brushing my jaw lightly, his touch both tender and possessive, as if he couldn't decide whether to comfort me or claim me. I was supposed to break you, he murmured, his voice almost a whisper now. Instead, you're the only thing keeping me from falling apart. The confession hung between us, fragile and burning, and I couldn't tell whether it was salvation or a trap. My heart was pounding, my thoughts unraveling, and still I couldn't look away. Because somewhere between the lies and the truth, between the fear and the desire, something had shifted. And I knew, no matter how much I wanted to deny it, that he wasn't the only one falling. There is a strange stillness that follows confession, a silence that stretches too long and too tight, the kind that hums beneath the skin because the truth, once spoken, cannot be folded back into the dark. It lingers between two people, binding them in a way that neither words nor promises ever could. And that night, standing in the golden half-light of Luca's library, I felt that truth curl around me like smoke, wrapping itself into the air I breathed, heavy and intoxicating and impossible to escape. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sound of the sea outside seeped faintly through the windows, soft and relentless, a reminder that somewhere beyond these walls the world still existed. People were laughing, living, falling in love, doing all the ordinary things that felt galaxies away from this suspended, charged silence. Luca's hand was still on my jaw, his thumb resting lightly against my skin, and though the touch was delicate, I could feel the power in it, the restrained tension of a man who could destroy or protect with equal ease. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a whisper, thin and trembling. You used me. His eyes didn't waver. I did. And now you expect me to just... what? Forgive you? He let out a slow breath, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. I don't expect forgiveness. Forgiveness is for men who regret what they've done. The blunt honesty of it made something twist inside me. Anger, maybe, or disbelief, or the cruel recognition that he was incapable of pretending. Then why tell me? I asked, stepping back, needing distance that the room refused to give. Why confess anything if you're not sorry? He took a step toward me, his voice lowering until it was almost a growl, the kind of sound that vibrates in your bones. Because I wanted you to know what kind of man I am before you start lying to yourself about who you're falling for. The words hit like a slap, sharp and merciless, but beneath them there was a flicker of something else. A warning, maybe even a plea, though he would never admit it. I wanted to shout at him, to hurl back the denial that trembled on my tongue, but the truth was already there, uncoiling in the quiet corners of my chest. I was falling for him, and it terrified me more than anything that had come before. He must have seen it in my face because he took another step closer, his shadow spilling over mine, the air thickening with the weight of him. You think I don't see it, he murmured, the way you look at me like you're trying to decide whether to kill me or kiss me. My pulse raced, my body betraying every thought I was trying to bury. You don't know what I want, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I know you want to understand me, he said, his tone quiet, dangerous in its calm. but understanding me means standing on the edge of a cliff and choosing not to step back. He reached out then, his fingers brushing my arm, tracing a slow line up to my shoulder, and the contact sent a shiver through me so violent it was almost pain. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. His touch was a promise and a warning at once, the kind of touch that says you can leave now. But if you stay, you're mine. Luca, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it was a plea for mercy or something darker. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. Tell me to stop. I opened my mouth to say it, to push him away, to break the spell before it swallowed me whole. But the word never came. Because when he kissed me, the world collapsed. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tender. It was hunger. Raw, consuming. The kind of kiss that devours logic and memory and leaves nothing but fire in its wake. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt the weight of everything he'd said, everything he'd done, pressed against my lips like an unspoken confession. I should have hated it, hated him. But all I could feel was the rush of heat, the ache of wanting something I shouldn't. When he finally pulled away, both of us were breathing hard, the air between us electric and unsteady. His eyes, usually so controlled, were dark and wild now, the mask slipping just enough for me to glimpse the man beneath. The man who ruled through fear and violence but was somehow undone by something as fragile as a kiss. That shouldn't have happened, I said, though the words trembled as they left my mouth. Maybe, he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. But it did. I turned away, pressing a hand to my chest as if I could calm the chaos inside me. But there was no undoing it. That kiss had shifted something irreversible, blurring the lines between danger and desire, between the captor and the captive. Don't look at me like that, he said softly, like I'm the villain and the cure at once. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. That's exactly what you are. He smiled faintly, but his eyes were distant now, the calm returning like armor sliding back into place. Then you'd better decide quickly which you need more. Before I could answer, the door opened, and one of his men entered, speaking rapid Italian. I caught only fragments. Problema, Porto, Ospiti. But Luca's expression hardened instantly, all traces of vulnerability erased. What is it? I asked, but he was already moving toward the door. Stay here, he said, his tone clipped, commanding. Tell me what's happening. He stopped, turned just enough to meet my gaze. Business, he said. But there was an edge to the word, a sharpness that made my stomach twist. Don't leave this room, no matter what you hear. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. I paced the length of the room, the air too thick, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance I thought I heard shouting. Faint but unmistakable. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time had become meaningless here. I crossed to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to glimpse the courtyard below. Shadows moved quickly, men with guns, the glint of headlights, and then Luca. He was standing near one of the cars, his voice raised, commanding, his movements sharp and precise. Even from a distance, he radiated control. But there was something different about him now. Urgency, tension, danger close enough to taste. And then I saw the man he was speaking to, broad-shouldered, unfamiliar, flanked by others who didn't belong to this house. Strangers. Rivals. My heart slammed against my ribs. The words from the previous night came rushing back. My world is built on loyalty and blood. Something was wrong. I stepped back from the window, the curtain slipping from my fingers, and in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening out there wasn't just business. It was a war, and I was standing in the middle of it. When the first gunshot cracked through the night, I didn't scream. I couldn't. The sound froze me in place, sharp and final. Another shot followed, then another, and the chaos below erupted like a storm. Shouting, engines, the metallic rhythm of violence echoing through the villa's walls. I pressed my back against the door, the wood cool against my skin, and tried to breathe. Somewhere below, Luca was fighting. For what? For who, I didn't know. But the image of him, calm and composed one moment, lethal the next, burned behind my eyes. The kiss still lingered on my lips, a ghost of something I couldn't name, and even as fear consumed me, a thought surfaced, quiet and terrifying in its clarity. If he survived the night, nothing between us would ever be the same. The first thing I remember is the sound, that impossible, shattering rhythm that didn't belong in the quiet beauty of this place. The percussion of violence echoing through the marble halls and across the open courtyards like thunder that had lost its way. It started as a distant staccato, something sharp and metallic cutting through the night. And then it grew closer, louder, until it filled every inch of air around me. I had heard gunfire before, on television, in movies, but never like this. Never so close that the walls trembled, never so real that it felt as if each shot were aimed directly at my pulse. For a moment I froze. Completely, utterly. My mind blank, and my body caught between the instinct to hide and the irrational, desperate need to run toward the chaos, toward him. I don't know what possessed me, whether it was fear or something deeper, but I moved, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor as I crossed the room, fumbling for the heavy wooden latch on the door. Luca had told me to stay, had looked at me with that commanding certainty that expected obedience, but the thought of him down there, of him bleeding or gone, was more unbearable than whatever punishment my disobedience might bring. When I finally managed to open the door, the hallway outside was dim and echoing with footsteps. Hurried, heavy, purposeful. Two of the guards passed at the far end, their weapons drawn, their voices low and urgent in Italian. I caught fragments. Attaccano dal porto, proteggere il padrone, nessuna pietà. Words that twisted my stomach into knots even though I didn't fully understand them. They didn't notice me. Or maybe they didn't care. And when they turned the corner, I slipped out, pressing myself against the cold stone walls as I followed the distant trail of noise. The villa that had seemed like a palace hours ago now felt like a labyrinth built to trap ghosts. The candlelight flickered madly along the walls, shadows stretching and twisting as if the house itself were panicking. Somewhere below, glass shattered. Someone screamed. Then another volley of gunfire tore through the night, closer this time, sharp enough to make me flinch. I don't remember how I found my way to the grand staircase, only that when I reached it, the front doors were open and the scent of salt and smoke rushed in with the wind. The courtyard beyond was chaos. Men shouting, engines roaring, the acrid tang of burning oil mingling with the sea air. The black cars I'd seen earlier were now half hidden behind bursts of gunfire, and the men who had once bowed to Luca's presence were now fighting, their loyalty written in blood. And there he was. Luca stood near the center of it all, coat discarded, shirt untucked, a pistol in one hand and a streak of blood running down his temple. His movements were sharp, efficient, terrifyingly graceful, the kind of precision that only comes from a lifetime of knowing violence. He wasn't hiding, behind anyone, wasn't barking orders from safety. He was in the thick of it, the kind of man who led by standing in the line of fire. For one heartbeat, I couldn't move. He turned slightly, his eyes catching the faint light from the flames, and when he saw me, something dark flashed across his face. Fury, fear, or both. "Inside!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Isabella, now!" But I couldn't go back. Not when I saw the man behind him raise a gun. I don't know what came over me. Instinct. Insanity. Some primitive reflex that didn't belong to the person I thought I was. But before I could think, I moved. The world narrowed into a blur of sound and motion, and I threw myself forward, shouting his name, my voice lost in the storm of noise. He turned just in time, catching sight of the attacker over my shoulder, and in one fluid motion he pulled me down, his arm curling around me as the shot went off. The bullet missed, striking the pillar behind us, the sound exploding in my ears like thunder. We hit the ground hard. I felt the air leave my lungs, and for a second everything went silent. Not because the world stopped, but because my mind did. His weight pressed against me, protective, heavy, and I could feel his heart pounding through his chest, the rhythm fierce and alive. He looked down at me, his face inches from mine, his breath ragged. "I told you to stay inside," he growled, his voice hoarse, the edge of command softened only by the panic in his eyes. "You were going to die," I gasped. He stared at me for a long moment, and then, impossibly, he laughed, a short, bitter sound that carried no joy. "Cara mia, if I die, it won't be because of them. It'll be because of you." He rose then, pulling me up with him, his hand gripping mine tightly, the contact burning like fire. "Stay behind me," he ordered, and this time I didn't argue. The next few minutes blurred into chaos. I followed him through the courtyard, ducking behind walls, the night lit intermittently by the muzzle flashes of gunfire. Men shouted orders in Italian, their voices overlapping, some in pain, others in fury. The smell of gasoline and blood thickened in the air, and the wind carried it inland, turning paradise into purgatory. At one point, one of the attackers, a man I didn't recognize, face half covered by a scarf, broke through the line of guards, lunging toward Luca with a knife. Before I could scream, Luca turned, caught the man's wrist, and with a single brutal motion twisted until I heard the sickening snap of bone. The knife clattered to the ground. Luca didn't hesitate. One strike, swift and final, and the man was gone. I should have looked away, but I didn't. I couldn't. Because for all the horror, there was something mesmerizing in his control. The precision of his violence, the cold purpose in his movements. It wasn't rage that drove him. It was something older, something that lived in his blood. And in that moment, I understood that this was the real Luca DeSantis, not the charming stranger who'd rescued me at an airport, not the man who kissed me like I was his salvation, but the heir to an empire built on power and blood. When the last of the noise began to fade, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of distant fire, he finally lowered his weapon. The courtyard was a graveyard of shadows and smoke, the marble stained dark beneath the dim light. I stood beside him, trembling, my breath coming in uneven gasps. He turned to me then, and for the first time, I saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of leadership, of violence, of everything he had become. His hands, still slick with blood, trembled slightly as he reached up to touch my face. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said softly, almost apologetically. I caught his wrist before he could pull away. "You think I don't know who you are?" I whispered. "I do now, and I'm still here." Something broke in his expression, a flicker of disbelief, of longing, of a man caught between damnation and the faintest glimpse of redemption. "Don't say that," he murmured. "Don't say things you'll regret." "I'm not the one who regrets," I said. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words hurt more than any wound, and when he opened them again, they were softer, stripped bare. "You have no idea what this world does to people who stay," he said. "You think this was bad? This was only a message. There will be more. There is always more." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because even as fear coiled through me, even as I looked at the bodies on the ground and the smoke curling into the night, I knew one thing with a terrifying certainty. I wasn't leaving him. And maybe that was my greatest mistake of all. The villa was quieter after the gunfire, but it wasn't peace that settled over the island. It was the stillness that follows violence, the breath the world takes while deciding whether to keep bleeding. The fires had been extinguished, the dead carried away, the scent of smoke and iron still clinging to the marble floors like a ghost that refused to leave. Every step I took echoed too loudly in the halls, the sound of my own heartbeat chasing me through corridors that now felt haunted by what I had seen. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Luca's hand tightening on the gun, the flash of muzzle light on his face, the expressionless precision with which he took a life. He had killed for me. I knew that now. It wasn't a story, or a threat, or a warning from someone else's mouth. I had watched him do it. Watched the man who had kissed me, held me, protected me, become the thing everyone whispered he was. And the most terrifying part of it all wasn't that I'd seen it. It was that I still wanted him. That realization sickened me more than the blood on the ground. I stood on the balcony outside my room, the dawn breaking pale and thin over the cliffs, the sea restless beneath a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or burn. I wanted to hate him, truly, deeply, cleanly. But every time I replayed the night in my head, I found new contradictions. The way his hand had trembled when he'd touched my face afterward. The way he'd looked at me like I was both the punishment and the absolution he'd spent his life avoiding. Love and fear were starting to taste the same, bitter and intoxicating, and I couldn't tell which one I was addicted to anymore. The door behind me opened softly. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. His presence filled the space before he spoke, the air shifting subtly, like the island itself bent to acknowledge him. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else, something almost tender. "I can't sleep," I replied, my hands gripping the balcony rail. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it all again." He moved closer, his footsteps slow, careful. "It's over now." I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Over? Do you think I can just pretend none of this happened?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was steady, practiced, but I could hear the crack beneath it. "Pretending is how people survive in my world." "I'm not in your world," I snapped, turning to face him, the wind catching my hair and tossing it across my face. "You keep saying I have a choice, but every time I try to make one, you take it away." His eyes darkened, that dangerous calm settling over him like a shadow. "If I'd let you choose," he said, "you'd be dead by now." "Then maybe that would have been better than this," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Something in him faltered. A flash of pain, quick and raw before he masked it again. He stepped closer until there was only a breath between us, his hand lifting as though he might touch me but stopping just shy of contact. "Don't say that," he murmured, his voice low, trembling with the kind of control that comes from a man used to suppressing everything that could hurt him. "Don't ever say that, Isabella." I stared up at him, hating how much I still wanted his touch. "You can't protect me from all this, Luca. You can't keep me here forever." He exhaled slowly. The sound waited. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this? Then what do you want?" He looked at me for a long time, his jaw tight, the muscles in his throat shifting as he swallowed something unspoken. "I want you safe," he said finally, "and the only way to keep you safe is to make you mine." The words hit like a blade wrapped in silk, soft, devastating, beautiful in their brutality. "Yours?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "You can't own people, Luca." He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You'd be surprised how much of the world already belongs to someone." I shook my head, stepping back, needing distance that the balcony couldn't give me. You don't get to cage me because you're afraid of losing control." He reached for me then, his hand closing around my wrist. Not harsh, but firm enough that I could feel the pulse beating through his skin. "Control is the only thing keeping you alive right now," he said quietly. "Do you understand? The men who came last night, they won't stop. You were never supposed to exist to them, and now they know your name." My breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you're not safe here. Not anywhere." The way he said it made my stomach drop. "Then what are you going to do?" He hesitated, and that was enough to tell me I wasn't going to like the answer. "I'm sending you away." The words struck like a slap. "No." He tightened his grip slightly, his eyes burning with that fierce, unrelenting resolve I had learned to fear. "It's not up for debate." I yanked my hand free. "After everything, after all this, you think you can just ship me off somewhere like I'm luggage you're tired of carrying?" "This isn't about what I want," he said, his voice rising now, the control slipping. "It's about what I have to do." "No, Luca," I said, stepping closer, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through his. "This is about guilt. You think if you send me away, you can pretend this didn't happen, that you didn't drag me into your war, that you didn't—" I stopped myself, the words catching in my throat. "That I didn't what?" he demanded. "That you didn't love me," I shouted. The silence that followed was deafening. He froze, his eyes wide, his breath shallow, as if I had just pulled the trigger on something neither of us could take back. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he took one slow step toward me, his expression unreadable. "You don't know what that word means," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me," I whispered back, the tears burning hot behind my eyes. "Tell me what it means to you." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw the man beneath the armor, the one who wasn't born to be cruel but had learned it because the world left him no choice. "It means," he said, his voice breaking, "that I would burn down everything I've ever built before I let anyone touch you." I felt the tears fall, hot and unstoppable. "Then why send me away?" "Because if you stay," he said, his hands trembling now, "I'll stop fighting. And when a man like me stops fighting, everyone he loves dies." I shook my head, refusing to believe it, refusing to accept the inevitability he spoke with. "You can't decide my life for me." "I already have," he said, and there was something final in his tone, a steel edge that told me the conversation was over. He turned then, walking back toward the doors, his shoulders tense, his posture rigid with everything he wasn't saying. I wanted to chase after him, to make him listen, to throw the truth at him until it broke through that wall of control. But before I could move, before I could even take a breath, a sound split the air. It wasn't gunfire this time. It was worse, sharper, closer, a scream from the courtyard below. Luca spun around, eyes flashing, and then came the second sound, the explosion. The balcony shook violently, the force knocking me backward, the world tilting into chaos. Glass shattered, stone cracked, the air filled with smoke and dust. I heard Luca shout my name, but the sound was distant, drowned in the roar of the blast. I reached for him, but the floor gave way beneath me, the edge of the balcony crumbling as the world went white. And then I was falling. When I woke, the world was too bright, too quiet, and for a long moment I didn't know where I was, or who I was. The air smelled of antiseptic and ocean salt, a strange pairing that felt both sterile and alive. And when I tried to move, pain radiated through my body in slow, cruel waves that made my breath catch in my throat. My vision blurred and then sharpened again, and I saw the ceiling above me, white, smooth, and unfamiliar, and realized I was no longer in the villa. The walls were different, the light softer, filtered through gauzy curtains that swayed gently in the breeze. The sea was close, I could hear it breathing. I turned my head, wincing at the ache that followed the movement, and saw Luca sitting in a chair beside the bed. His elbows rested on his knees, his head bowed, his dark hair disheveled in a way I had never seen before. He looked human, not like the untouchable figure who commanded men and defied death, but like a man who had finally met something even he couldn't control. When I tried to speak, my voice cracked. "Luca." He lifted his head instantly, his eyes finding mine, and in that moment I saw everything. Fear, relief, exhaustion, guilt. He looked at me the way people look at miracles they don't believe they deserve. "Dio," he breathed, standing so quickly that the chair scraped against the floor. "You're awake." I swallowed, my throat dry and raw. "What happened?" He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to touch me at first, as though afraid I might break. "There was a bomb," he said quietly. "They planted it in the courtyard, under one of the cars. We didn't see it until it was too late." The memory came rushing back. The sound, the heat, the ground vanishing beneath me. "I fell," I whispered. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "You did." "The balcony collapsed. I thought—" He stopped, his voice catching. "I thought I'd lost you." "You didn't," I said softly. His hand found mine then, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around my wrist. He held me like a man clinging to something fragile, something holy. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I almost did. And that I can't forgive." I frowned, trying to piece the words together through the haze of pain and exhaustion. "Can't forgive who?" He looked away, toward the window, the sea reflected in his eyes. "Myself," he said simply. For a long time we said nothing. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd done to each other, and for each other. I thought of all the moments that had led us here. The airport, the flight, the kiss, the gunfire, each one a thread in a tapestry woven from choices that couldn't be undone. "Where are we?" I asked finally. "Another house," he said. "Smaller, remote. No one knows about it. You're safe here." "Safe," I repeated, the word strange on my tongue. "Does that even exist anymore?" He looked back at me then, and the faintest smile curved his lips. Sad, unsteady but real. "For you," he said, "I'll make it exist." He stayed with me as the days blurred into one another. I healed slowly, my body remembering the fall even when my mind tried to forget it. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night, the echo of the explosion still ringing in my ears. And he would be there, sitting by the window or pacing the room like a caged storm. He never slept much. When I asked him why, he would say, "Because sleep is for men who don't have ghosts." And I would wonder how many haunted him. But there were moments, brief, precious moments, when the world seemed almost ordinary. We would eat together on the terrace overlooking the sea, and he would tell me stories about Sicily, about his mother who loved the ocean and his father who feared it, about how he used to swim too far from shore just to see how long it would take before someone noticed. And I realized then that he wasn't born a monster. He had been forged into one. The boy he had been had died long before the man I met was created. One evening, when the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in gold and crimson, he brought me something, a small velvet box. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding, and inside was a ring. It wasn't delicate or dainty. It was bold, old-fashioned, with a dark sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the fading light like fire. I looked up at him, my breath caught. "What is this?" His expression softened, but his eyes held that same intensity that had always undone me. "It's not a proposal," he said. "Not in the way you think. It's a promise. A claim if you want it to be. A crown for the woman who walked into my world and refused to bow. I stared at the ring, my thoughts spiraling. You don't need to claim me, Luca. He smiled, faintly. No, he said, but I need you to know that no one else will. He slid the ring onto my finger before I could protest. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The weight of it was both comforting and terrifying, a symbol of everything we were. Passion and danger, love and destruction, bound together so tightly that separating one from the other would tear us both apart. Do you regret it? I asked after a moment, my voice barely above a whisper. Any of it? He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was dissolving into the sea. Every day, he said, and not once. That night he kissed me again, not with the hunger of before, but with something deeper, something that felt like surrender. It was the kind of kiss that says I've found my home, even if it kills me. And maybe it already had. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time didn't matter anymore. The world beyond the island faded, reduced to rumors and whispers brought by the few loyal men who still came and went. I overheard fragments of conversations, words like vendetta, revenge, Giordano, and I understood that the war hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. Luca tried to keep it from me, but I knew. I always knew. One night I found him standing outside, his phone still glowing faintly in his hand, his jaw clenched. What happened? I asked, even though I already knew. They came again, he said quietly. They found one of our warehouses on the mainland. 2 men are dead. I stepped closer, my hand brushing his arm. You can't keep fighting forever. He turned to me then, his eyes dark and unyielding. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do, I said. You could walk away. We both could. He laughed softly, shaking his head. Walk away from what I am. There's no leaving this life, Isabella. There's only surviving it. Something in his tone told me the decision had already been made. And as I looked at him, the man who had stolen me, saved me, destroyed me, loved me, I realized that maybe I wasn't meant to leave either. Maybe the fire wasn't something to escape. Maybe it was something to rule. The next morning I found him in the study, poring over maps and names, planning what came next. I walked up behind him, placed my hand on his shoulder, and when he looked up, I met his gaze steadily. If you go to war, I said softly, you don't go alone. His expression broke, a flash of anguish, of awe, of something that might have been love so fierce it bordered on fear. You don't belong in this world, he said. Maybe not, I whispered, but I chose it. And that was the truth of it. I had been abandoned once, cast aside by a man who couldn't stand beside me when life got hard, and now here I was, standing beside one who had been forged in hardship itself. When he pulled me into his arms, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate, protective, eternal. Then God help anyone who tries to take you from me again, he murmured against my hair. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my hand, and I knew that whatever came next, blood, power, vengeance, love, it would be ours. Because I was no longer the girl who had been left at the airport in tears. I was the woman who had boarded the wrong plane and found her destiny waiting in the wreckage. And if loving Luca DeSantis meant walking through fire, then so be it. Because in the end, I hadn't just survived his world. I had learned how to wear its crown.